What if the most effective strategy in history wasn't clever, wasn't honorable, but terrifyingly brutal? What if an empire rose to power not by winning battles or earning loyalty, but by instilling fear so absolute, so precise, that resistance became unthinkable? And what if that very strategy, the one that made them unstoppable, carried a cost so deep it would haunt generations forever? This is the story of an imperial strategy so brutal, it actually worked. What if the most effective strategy ever used by an empire was not built on wisdom, justice, or even strength, but on something so brutal that history prefers not to name it? For centuries, we've told ourselves a comforting story about power. We say empires rise because they are smarter, more organized, more civilized. We imagine law replacing chaos, order replacing violence, progress replacing fear. It's a story that lets us believe domination can be clean, even benevolent. That authority, when wrapped in symbols and institutions, somehow becomes moral. But that story exists for one reason only: it helps us sleep at night. Because the truth, when stripped of ceremony and myth, is far more unsettling. Every empire, no matter how polished its legacy, begins the same way, surrounded by enemies, drowning in uncertainty, and terrified of collapse. Before the marble monuments, before the grand speeches in rewritten histories, there is panic. There is the realization that power is fragile, that obedience is temporary, and that loyalty evaporates the moment fear disappears. In those early moments, when survival is not guaranteed, empires do not ask what is right. They ask what works, and what works is rarely beautiful. We tend to imagine brutality as a failure of leadership, a lapse, a mistake, a sign of weakness. But history tells a different story. The most enduring empires did not stumble into cruelty. They engineered it. They refined it. They studied human behavior with ruthless clarity and arrived at a conclusion that still makes us uncomfortable today: fear is faster than force, cheaper than war, and far more reliable than trust. This is where the illusion of civilization begins to crack. Because civilization, at its core, is a performance. Laws only matter if people believe disobedience carries consequences. Culture only spreads if resistance feels futile. Order only exists when chaos understands it will be punished. Not occasionally, not unpredictably, but with absolute certainty. Empires do not rely on kindness to achieve this certainty. They rely on demonstration. Long before the strategy had a name, before it became doctrine, people whispered about it. Not in official records, but in rumors. Stories that traveled faster than armies ever could. Villages that surrendered without a fight. Cities that opened their gates at the mere mention of imperial arrival. Entire populations that chose obedience without seeing a single soldier. To outsiders, it looked like magic. To those inside the empire, it felt like control perfected. But to those who experienced it firsthand, it felt like something else entirely. The brilliance of the strategy was not in how much violence it used, but in how little. It was selective, surgical, designed not to conquer land, but to conquer imagination. The empire understood something most rulers never fully grasped: humans don't fear pain as much as they fear uncertainty. A quick death is tragic. A predictable punishment is manageable. But an example, delivered publicly, decisively, and without mercy, creates a shadow that lasts for generations. Once people believe the worst can happen, they don't wait to see if it will. This is where most historical accounts grow vague. They speak in abstractions, harsh measures, firm responses, necessary actions. Language becomes a shield, because the reality beneath it is too sharp. The strategy demanded that a line be crossed, once, unmistakably, so that it would never need to be crossed again. It required an act so overwhelming that resistance itself would feel irrational. And that is the paradox at the heart of this story. The empire did not see itself as cruel. It saw itself as efficient. Every rebellion crushed meant fewer rebellions later. Every example made reduced the need for future bloodshed. In the cold mathematics of power, brutality was framed as mercy on a larger scale. Fewer wars, fewer uprisings, fewer dead, so long as everyone remembered what happened the last time someone refused to obey. At first, even the architects of the strategy hesitated. They understood the risk, not of failure, but of success. Because once fear becomes the foundation of order, there is no graceful way to replace it. You can build faster, you can expand further, you can dominate longer, but you can never pretend innocence again. Still, hesitation fades quickly when survival is at stake. The empire was cornered. Its borders were unstable. Its enemies were many. Conventional tactics had failed. Negotiations were ignored. Displays of strength were tested and challenged. Each act of restraint was interpreted as weakness. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the leadership reached the conclusion that would change everything. They needed to make resistance unthinkable. Not difficult, not costly, unthinkable. This was not about punishment. It was about messaging. A single act, carefully chosen, would speak louder than 1,000 victories. It would not need explanation. It would not need repetition. Its power would lie in what people imagined, not just what they saw. And once unleashed, it would spread on its own, fear carried by rumor, amplified by silence, perfected by uncertainty. The Empire knew that after this, there would be no going back. The world would see them differently. History would judge them harshly, or perhaps not at all, if history itself was written by their hand. But judgment was a problem for the future. Control was the problem of the present. So they prepared, not with celebration, not with confidence, but with a quiet, almost clinical resolve. The strategy was not born from rage or sadism. It was born from clarity. A clear-eyed understanding of human nature, stripped of idealism. People obey not because they love power, but because they fear the cost of defying it. And once that cost is proven, only once, it echoes forever. What the Empire was about to do would end resistance before it began. It would bring peace without persuasion, expansion without battle, order without loyalty. It would work so well that future generations would struggle to believe it ever happened at all. But the first time, there is always a first time, would change everything. And the most terrifying part, it worked exactly as planned. Why do people obey power even when no one is watching? Because power does not rely on presence. It relies on belief. And belief, once planted deeply enough, polices itself. The Empire understood this long before its enemies did. It understood that soldiers grow tired, borders stretch thin, and force, no matter how overwhelming, has limits. Armies must march, weapons must be carried. Violence, when used constantly, becomes expensive, predictable, and eventually, resistible. But fear travels effortlessly. Fear requires no supply lines. Fear does not sleep. This is the part history often gets wrong. We imagine empires expanding outward, projecting strength through endless displays of military dominance. But the most successful ones learned to do the opposite. They turned inward, into the human mind. They studied how rumors spread faster than orders, how stories outlived witnesses, how memory could be sharper than any blade. The Empire realized that if it could control what people expected to happen, it wouldn't need to constantly prove itself. Power, in its purest form, is psychological. This is why the strategy never relied on constant brutality. That would have defeated its purpose. Too much violence dulls fear. It makes suffering ordinary. Ordinary things are questioned. But rarity makes people whisper. It makes them fill in the gaps themselves. And what people imagine is always worse than reality. So the Empire spoke softly, but ensured everyone knew exactly what it was capable of. The brilliance lay in restraint. When resistance emerged, it was not always crushed. Sometimes it was ignored, sometimes it was allowed to burn itself out. This inconsistency wasn't weakness, it was design. No one could predict when the Empire would respond, or how. And unpredictability sharpened anxiety into obedience. People stopped asking whether rebellion was possible. They asked whether it was worth the risk. It never was. This strategy turned fear into a background noise of daily life. It didn't dominate conversations openly. It lingered beneath them, a shared understanding, passed quietly between parents and children, neighbors and friends. Don't draw attention. Don't stand out. Don't test limits. The Empire didn't need to say these things. The population said them to each other. That was the moment control became self-sustaining. Even officials within the Empire began to notice the shift. Regions once hostile now complied before demands were issued. Taxes were paid early. Laws were followed meticulously. The absence of resistance was so complete it felt unnatural. Order had been achieved without negotiation, without persuasion, without compromise. From a strategic standpoint, it was perfection. From a human one, it was something else entirely. Because fear reshapes behavior, but it also reshapes identity. People stop asking who they are and begin asking how visible they are. Courage becomes recklessness. Silence becomes wisdom. Survival becomes morality. And slowly, quietly, an entire population adjusts its values to fit within the boundaries of terror. The Empire told itself this was stability. But stability built on fear is not peace. It is paralysis. Still, the results were undeniable. Expansion accelerated. Resources flowed. Enemies dissolved before contact. Other powers watched in confusion, unable to understand how control could be so absolute without constant war. They mistook the Empire's quiet borders for harmony. They didn't realize they were looking at the aftermath of something far more violent than battle. Because battles end, fear doesn't. Inside the Empire's highest circles, the strategy was spoken of cautiously. Never celebrated, never glorified, it was treated like a tool too dangerous to admire openly. A necessary instrument, locked away but always within reach. Everyone knew that once used, it changed the rules forever. That it trained people not to trust mercy. That it made obedience automatic, but loyalty impossible. Yet no one argued against it. Because it had solved the one problem every empire faces and few survive: how to rule without constantly proving you deserve to rule. How to make authority feel inevitable. How to make resistance feel foolish before it even forms. The Empire had found its answer. But answers have consequences. And while fear is powerful, it is also fragile. It must be maintained carefully. Mishandled, it turns inward. Pushed too far, it stops controlling and starts consuming. The Empire had not yet learned this. At this stage, it only saw results. Silence, compliance, growth, and silence, when mistaken for peace, can be dangerously convincing. Because the strategy had not yet been tested against its greatest challenge, not rebellion, not invasion, but time. Time erodes fear. Memory fades. New generations ask questions old ones were too afraid to voice. And when fear must be reminded of itself, it demands repetition. That moment, the moment the Empire would have to decide whether to use the strategy again, was approaching. And when it arrived, restraint would no longer be enough. What happens when an empire decides to stop hinting, and starts proving? The first time the strategy was fully unleashed, it wasn't announced. There was no declaration, no warning sent ahead of it. The Empire chose its moment with care, selecting a place that mattered just enough to be noticed, but not enough to risk everything if it failed. This was not conquest. This was an experiment, a single act designed to answer one question: would fear, once made undeniable, spread faster than resistance? The target had all the familiar signs of defiance. Quiet refusal, delayed compliance, a growing belief that the Empire's reach had limits. Nothing dramatic, nothing overt, just enough to suggest that authority was being tested. To the Empire, that made it perfect. Because the strategy was never meant for the defiant alone. It was meant for everyone else who was watching. The response was swift, precise, and deliberately overwhelming. Not widespread destruction, not chaos, the opposite. Order imposed with terrifying clarity. The punishment was focused, intentional, and impossible to misunderstand. Those directly involved were dealt with publicly, decisively, and without appeal. No negotiations, no mercy, no room for reinterpretation. The message was not spoken, it was demonstrated. And then the Empire withdrew. This was the most unsettling part. There was no occupation, no lingering threat, no attempt to explain or justify what had happened. The silence afterward was deliberate. It forced observers to confront what they had seen without guidance, without narrative control. People were left alone with their thoughts, and their fear did the rest. The effect was immediate. Word spread outward in fragments. Stories distorted by distance and imagination. Each retelling sharpened the edges, filled in gaps with darker assumptions. The truth mattered less than the emotional impact. What people believed happened became more powerful than what actually occurred. Entire regions changed their behavior based on rumor alone. Garrisons reported something unprecedented: compliance without presence. Cities sent envoys preemptively. Leaders pledged loyalty without being asked. Rebellions that had been forming quietly dissolved overnight. The Empire didn't need to pursue them. They collapsed under the weight of expectation. This was the moment the strategy proved itself. Inside the Imperial court, reactions were mixed. Some were disturbed by how effective it had been. Others were relieved. A few were quietly impressed. But no one could deny the results. One act had achieved what years of warfare had failed to accomplish. Borders stabilized. Resources flowed. Authority solidified. The Empire had crossed a threshold. Because after that moment, every decision was reframed. Every negotiation carried an unspoken reminder. Every refusal was weighed against memory. The strategy no longer needed to be used. Its existence was enough. Fear had been installed like infrastructure, invisible, ever-present, and relied upon by all. But something else had changed too. Those who carried out the act did not celebrate. They did not boast. They returned altered, quieter, more distant. The Empire did not ask how they felt. It asked whether the objective had been achieved. And it had, so whatever was lost in the process was considered irrelevant. That was the second threshold. Because when effectiveness becomes the only metric, humanity becomes a variable, not a constant. The strategy demanded emotional distance. To function, it required that compassion be treated as a liability. And once that mindset took hold, it began to spread, not just through policy, but through culture. Officials stopped questioning orders. Citizens stopped asking why. Everyone learned that survival depended on alignment, not understanding. The Empire grew calmer on the surface and colder beneath it. Stability was achieved, but at the cost of something unmeasurable. Still, no one pushed back. Because the alternative was unthinkable. The success of the first application did more than silence resistance. It rewired expectations. The Empire had shown that it was willing to go further than anyone else dared. That it would cross lines others only threatened to approach. And once that reputation was established, it became self-reinforcing. Rivals hesitated. Allies complied. Subjects obeyed. Fear had done what armies could not. But strategies that rely on reputation carry a hidden weakness. Reputation must be maintained. And maintenance, over time, demands repetition. The Empire now possessed a weapon it could not afford to discard, and could not safely overuse. At this stage, the leadership believed they were in control of it. They believed the strategy belonged to them. They had not yet realized that fear, once unleashed, answers to no one. How do you justify cruelty once it stops being an exception? At first, the Empire told itself a careful lie. What had happened was unique. Necessary. A final measure used only because circumstances demanded it. There would be no need to repeat it. Fear would carry the burden now. Order would sustain itself. The strategy could remain sealed away, remembered but unused. That belief lasted longer than it should have. Because success creates imitation. What works once invites repetition, not out of malice, but out of convenience. Officials facing unrest began to wonder whether restraint was irresponsible. Commanders hesitated to negotiate when they knew a faster solution existed. The question quietly shifted from should we use it to why wouldn't we? And when that shift happens, policy follows. The strategy was never formally announced as doctrine. That would have been too visible. Instead, it seeped into decision-making through precedent. One official cited another. One response justified the next. What had once required direct approval became routine. Language softened around it. Stability operations. Preventive measures. Words designed to dull the edge of reality. Brutality, once named, repels. Brutality, once abstracted, becomes manageable. This was the moment the Empire stopped reacting, and started planning. The strategy was refined. Variables were studied. How much force created fear without sparking chaos? How public should the act be? How quickly should silence follow? The Empire treated terror like a science, optimizing it for efficiency and longevity. And the results were extraordinary. Expansion accelerated beyond expectation. Regions surrendered without confrontation. Borders grew not through conquest, but consent born of dread. Other powers, watching from a distance, misinterpreted what they saw. They believed the Empire had achieved a rare harmony. That its rule was accepted. That resistance had simply disappeared. They were wrong. Resistance hadn't vanished. It had gone underground. It had learned the same lesson everyone else had. Visibility was dangerous. Survival required patience. And patience, when combined with resentment, does not dissolve, it ferments. Inside the Empire, life appeared orderly. Laws were obeyed meticulously. Crime dropped. Protests ceased. But this calm carried a strange weight. Conversations became cautious. Humor grew restrained. People learned to read rooms before speaking. Trust narrowed to small circles. Fear didn't scream. It whispered. And whispers travel far. Those tasked with enforcing the strategy changed as well. They became efficient, professional, detached. The Empire rewarded results, not reflection. Questions were seen as hesitation. Hesitation was seen as risk. Over time, the emotional distance required to carry out orders became permanent. The line between duty and identity blurred. The strategy had reshaped not only how the Empire ruled, but who its people were becoming. Still, leadership focused on metrics. Stability, growth, silence. By every measurable standard, the Empire was thriving. It had achieved something few powers ever had: dominance without constant war. The brutality that once shocked now functioned like infrastructure, rarely noticed, but essential. That was when the first warning signs appeared. They were subtle, easy to dismiss, Minor incidents that didn't escalate as expected. Individuals who did not react with fear, but with resignation. Others who reacted with anger instead of submission. These moments were isolated, inconsistent, and inconvenient. So they were ignored. The Empire believed fear was permanent. But fear has a shelf life. It must be refreshed, reinforced, remembered. And the more it is used, the more it demands escalation to remain effective. What once terrified becomes familiar. What once silenced begins to provoke. The strategy that had worked because it was rare was now drifting toward normality. And normality is the enemy of terror. The Empire stood at a dangerous crossroads, though it did not yet recognize it. To preserve control, it would eventually have to choose, use the strategy again and risk changing how it was perceived, or refrain, and risk appearing weak. Neither option was safe. The system they had built could not tolerate mercy. And it could not survive restraint forever. Somewhere within the Empire, quietly and unnoticed, someone was paying close attention. Someone who understood that fear, once it stops shocking, does not disappear. It transforms. And when it does, it turns outward, or inward, with devastating force. What happens to a people when fear becomes the air they breathe? At first, no one could point to the exact moment things changed. There was no single decree, no visible collapse. Life continued, markets opened, laws were followed, the Empire appeared stable, stronger than ever. But beneath the surface, something fundamental was eroding. Not order, but meaning. Not obedience, but belief. Fear had done its job too well. Children grew up learning caution before curiosity. They learned what not to say long before they learned why. History was taught carefully, trimmed of edges, shaped into something safe and incomplete. The Empire presented itself as inevitable, eternal. Questioning it felt not just dangerous, but pointless. And that quiet surrender reshaped generations. People adapted in ways that looked like loyalty from a distance. They complied early. They praised publicly. They avoided attention. But inside, something hardened. Fear does not inspire devotion, it inspires calculation. Every act becomes strategic. Every relationship conditional. Trust shrinks to the smallest possible unit. The Empire mistook this adaptation for unity. Those most affected by the strategy were rarely discussed. Their names disappeared from records. Their stories became warnings rather than memories. People did not speak of them with anger or grief, but with caution, as if even remembering carried risk. This was the deepest victory of the strategy. It taught people to police not just their actions, but their thoughts. And yet, suppression does not erase emotion. It compresses it. Anger had nowhere to go, so it turned inward. Hope had no language, so it became private. The Empire had created a population that survived expertly, but lived narrowly. Over time, that narrowness became unbearable. Not explosive, not dramatic, just heavy, suffocating. Even those who benefited from the Empire's power felt it. Officials, merchants, citizens protected by status, all of them understood that their security was conditional. Fear is impartial. It does not stop at class or loyalty. Everyone knew that a single misstep could shift their position from protected to exposed. That knowledge changes people. It breeds caution, but also resentment. A resentment that cannot speak its name. A resentment that watches and waits. The Empire believed silence meant acceptance. It did not realize silence was becoming something else, accumulation. Among the enforcers, the strain was different. They carried out orders with efficiency, but the cost followed them home. Emotional distance turned into isolation. Isolation turned into numbness. Some justified their role as necessary. Others stopped justifying at all. The strategy demanded obedience, but it offered no meaning in return. This was the hidden tax of terror. And then there were those who studied it. Quietly, carefully, individuals began to understand the pattern. They noticed that the strategy worked best when it was remembered, not repeated. That its power came from rarity. From myth. From the unknown. They realized that fear, once exposed as a system rather than a force of nature, could be challenged, not directly, but indirectly. These were not rebels in the traditional sense. They did not protest. They did not organize openly. They observed. They waited. They understood that confronting the Empire head-on was suicide. But surviving it required something else entirely. Time. The Empire, meanwhile, was growing complacent. Its leaders had inherited a system that worked, without having built it themselves. To them, fear was simply part of governance, no different from law or taxation. They believed it could be calibrated endlessly, applied whenever needed, withdrawn at will. They believed they controlled it. But fear does not belong to those who wield it. It belongs to those who feel it. And over time, it changes shape. It stops paralyzing and starts clarifying. It forces people to ask a dangerous question: what do we actually have left to lose? That question had not yet been asked openly. But it was forming, in private conversations, in unspoken looks, in the quiet resolve of people who had learned that survival under fear is not the same as living. The Empire had achieved total control. What it had not achieved was loyalty. And without loyalty, control is only borrowed, never owned. The strategy had built an empire faster than anyone thought possible. Now it was quietly building something else. Something that would not be afraid forever. What does an empire do when fear stops being enough? For a long time, the empire didn't notice the shift. From the outside, everything still looked perfect. No uprisings, no open dissent, no challenges to authority. Reports spoke of compliance and order, of efficiency and growth. By every traditional measure of power, the system was working exactly as designed. But power does not fail loudly at first. It weakens silently. The first signs appeared as hesitation, not among the ruled, but among the rulers. Officials began to delay decisions that once felt automatic. They sensed, without fully understanding, that the balance had changed. Orders were still followed, but with a precision that felt cold rather than cooperative. Obedience had become mechanical, and mechanical systems, while reliable, are brittle. The empire had reached the peak of its control. Fear no longer needed reinforcement. Memory alone was enough. The strategy existed now as legend, as warning, as shared understanding. It was spoken of less and less, which leaders took as proof of its success. In reality, it was being studied. Those who lived under the empire had learned its patterns. They knew when force was likely and when it was not. They recognized the moments of hesitation, the bureaucratic delays, the reliance on reputation rather than action. They saw that the strategy had become a crutch, powerful, yes, but inflexible. Fear had frozen the empire into a single posture. And that posture could not adapt. The first true challenge did not arrive as rebellion. It arrived as indifference, a refusal to be provoked, a quiet resistance that did not trigger the mechanisms of terror. When authority demanded a reaction, it received none. When it threatened, it was met with stillness. No outrage, no fear, just compliance without conviction. To the empire, this was deeply unsettling. Fear works best when people care deeply about the outcome. But generations raised under constant threat had learned emotional detachment. They complied because it was easier, not because they believed. And belief is what fear ultimately feeds on. Without it, terror loses its sharpness. Some leaders argued that the strategy needed to be used again, to remind people. Others warned that repetition would erode its power. The debate itself was dangerous. It revealed uncertainty, and uncertainty, once perceived, spreads quickly. The empire chose caution. It waited. That waiting was interpreted as weakness. Not openly, not loudly, but perceptibly. The population sensed that the line had shifted. That the empire was reluctant to cross it again. Fear, once absolute, now had conditions. And conditions invite calculation. Small acts followed. Symbolic, easily deniable, a delayed order, a procedural challenge, nothing that justified a brutal response, yet everything that tested resolve. The empire found itself trapped by its own creation. If it responded with full force, it risked awakening what fear had kept dormant. If it didn't, it risked revealing that the threat was hollow. This was the fatal dilemma. The strategy had worked because it was extraordinary. Now it was expected, and expectations demand fulfillment. Inside the empire, divisions deepened. Some officials pushed for decisive action, arguing that fear must be refreshed before it faded completely. Others feared that a second demonstration would not terrify, but unite. That people who had lived too long under control had nothing left to fear but continuation. Both sides were right, and that was the problem. When the empire finally acted, it did so not from confidence, but from necessity. The target was chosen carefully, again. The act was designed to be unmistakable, again. But something was different this time. The silence that followed was not filled with dread. It was filled with anger. Not chaotic, not explosive, focused, shared. The memory that once paralyzed now connected people. What had isolated them individually now united them collectively. Fear had taught them the cost of defiance, but it had also taught them the cost of submission. The strategy had reached its limit. What had once prevented resistance had become the reason for it. The empire's greatest weapon no longer inspired obedience. It inspired resolve. A quiet understanding that if brutality was inevitable, then obedience offered no safety. And once that realization took hold, fear lost its final advantage. The empire had built itself on terror so effective it reshaped the world. Now it was discovering the truth no strategy can escape forever. Control achieved through fear is never permanent. It only waits for the moment it stops working. What happens when the weapon that built an empire turns against it? The breaking point did not arrive as a single explosion. It arrived as a chain reaction, small, contained failures that fed into one another until the system could no longer absorb them. The empire responded the only way it knew how, with force calibrated by habit rather than insight. But habits are blunt instruments, and this moment required precision the empire no longer possessed. Fear was deployed again. The act was meant to reassert control, to remind everyone of the cost of defiance. It followed the established pattern: public, decisive, uncompromising. On paper, it was flawless. In reality, it was catastrophic. Instead of silence, there was recognition. People did not recoil. They did not scatter. They saw the strategy for what it was, not an inevitable force, but a choice. A repeated choice. And once brutality becomes predictable, it loses its mystique. Once people know the price, they can decide whether it is worth paying. This time, many decided it was. The empire had underestimated something fear had been suppressing for generations: shared memory. The same stories that once isolated people now connected them. The same examples meant to warn now served as proof. Proof that submission did not guarantee safety. Proof that restraint was not rewarded. Proof that the system would never soften on its own. Defiance spread, not as chaos, but as coordination. The empire tried to respond faster, harder, more decisively. But escalation revealed desperation. Each act confirmed what many had begun to suspect: the empire needed fear more than fear needed the empire. That dependence was visible now. And visibility is fatal to terror. Enforcers hesitated. Some refused orders. Others carried them out mechanically, without conviction. Authority fractured at the edges. The strategy, once carried by absolute compliance, now encountered resistance from within its own machinery. This was the moment the empire truly lost control. Not because it lacked power, but because power no longer commanded belief. Fear could still hurt, it could still kill, but it could no longer convince. And without conviction, violence becomes merely destructive, not controlling. The population responded with something the empire had not prepared for: endurance. Not reckless rebellion, but sustained refusal. Systems slowed. Cooperation became conditional. Order unraveled quietly, methodically. Fear had trained people to be patient. Now that patience was turned outward, leadership fractured. Some demanded total suppression, others negotiation. But negotiation requires trust, and trust cannot grow in soil poisoned by terror. Every offer was viewed as a tactic. Every pause as manipulation. The empire had destroyed its own credibility. What followed was not a dramatic collapse, but a hollowing. Control evaporated in places that still looked intact. Authority existed in name only. The empire's reach exceeded its grasp. And fear, once the glue holding everything together, had become corrosive. Eventually, the strategy stopped being used, not because it was abandoned, but because it no longer worked. Its repetition had stripped it of power. Its brutality had unified what it once divided. The empire faced a truth it could not escape. The same mechanism that prevents resistance also prevents recovery. When fear fails, there is nothing beneath it. In the end, the empire did not fall because it was overthrown. It fell because it could not transform. It had built a system optimized for control, not survival beyond control. And when circumstances demanded adaptation, it had none left. History would argue about the strategy for centuries. Some would call it genius. Others would call it monstrous. Both would be correct. It did work, spectacularly, until it didn't. Because fear is a powerful tool, but a terrible foundation. And the empire learned, too late, that what holds people down can never hold them together. That is the final cost of a strategy so brutal it actually works. What remains after fear is gone? Long after the empire's power receded, long after its borders dissolved and its authority fragmented, the strategy outlived the empire itself. Not as policy, not as doctrine, but as memory. Memory etched into behavior, language, and instinct. The empire was gone, but the shape it carved into the human mind remained. Former subjects struggled to explain what had happened to them. There were no single moments to point to, no clear beginning or end. Just years lived under an invisible weight. Even in freedom, they spoke cautiously. Even without enforcers, they hesitated. Fear had trained them well. Too well. The empire no longer needed to exist for its influence to persist. This was the strategy's final achievement. Historians argued endlessly. Some praised the empire's efficiency, its unprecedented stability, its rapid expansion without constant war. They pointed to the numbers, the growth, the silence. Others focused on the cost, the emotional damage, the generational trauma, the erosion of trust that outlasted any political structure. They spoke of what was lost, not what was gained. Neither side could fully claim the truth. Because the strategy was never about morality. It was about results, and the results were undeniable. For a time, fear delivered what no ideology, no army, no diplomacy ever had: total compliance. But it also ensured that when compliance ended, nothing else could take its place. No loyalty, no belief, no shared purpose, only absence. The ruins of the empire did not look dramatic. There were no grand finales. No single day when the world changed. Just a slow realization that authority no longer meant anything. That commands were suggestions. That fear, once omnipresent, had become background noise, ignored, then forgotten. What replaced it was uneven and fragile. Some communities rebuilt carefully, learning trust from scratch. Others fell into cycles of suspicion, unable to believe in power without threat. The empire had taught them too well. Authority was dangerous, and obedience was survival. That lesson proved difficult to unlearn. And this is where the story stops pretending it belongs only to the past. Because the strategy did not disappear with the empire. It evolved. It softened its language. It hid behind procedures and policies and abstractions. But the logic remained the same: make the cost of resistance so high that people choose compliance without being asked. Fear does not need banners or borders. It only needs memory. So the final question is not whether the strategy was effective. History has already answered that. The question is simpler, and far more dangerous. If brutality works, and works extraordinarily well, how many times will humanity choose it again before remembering why it must never last? Because every empire that builds itself on fear believes one thing with absolute certainty: that it will be the last one to ever need it. And so the empire's story ends, not with a thunderous collapse, not with dramatic battles, but with quiet consequences that outlive even the strongest walls and armies. What remains is a paradox: a strategy so brutally effective that it built an empire, maintained control, and reshaped generations, yet so corrosive that it ensured the empire could never truly endure. Power achieved through terror is temporary, and when the fear fades, or is finally understood, it leaves only emptiness where loyalty, trust, and belief should have been. The people who survived carried scars invisible to the eye but permanent in the mind. Some rebuilt cautiously, trying to learn trust again. Others never recovered, passing down habits of silence, suspicion, and self-preservation. And though the empire itself crumbled, the memory of its method persisted, a shadow longer than any wall, deeper than any law, whispering to anyone who would wield control: fear works, but it always demands a price. And so history repeats itself in quiet ways. Leaders study the past, wonder at what worked, and some are tempted to try it again. Because when survival and power are at stake, the logic of fear is seductive, and its results are undeniable. But the question lingers for every generation, for every empire, for every human. If cruelty is effective, how far are you willing to go before it consumes you? The empire is gone, its rulers are gone, its cities may have fallen, but its legacy, its brutal lesson, is eternal. And somewhere, in the silence between obedience and rebellion, that lesson waits for the next one brave, or desperate, enough to test it. The story ends here, not with victory, not with justice, but with the uneasy truth that the most effective strategy the world has ever known was also the most dangerous, and that its echo will never truly die.